with potting mix, when you're planting into the plastic cells, you want it to be wet enough so that when you squeeze it like that, it sort of holds together a little bit and doesn't just fall apart, but not so wet that when you squeeze it, it drips water, anything like that. All right, so here's a neat little trick. Fill them so they're overflowing, and then you tamp it down like that, and then you take something of the same size and push it down a little. That way there's not air pockets in it when the seed starts making roots. I'm gonna do 2 seeds per cell in these. And the rule of thumb with planting seeds is you want to bury them twice the depth of the seed. So these are pretty thin, so we're not going to put a whole lot of soil on top of this. Okay. And inside I have a sprayer bottle, so in a little while I'll come out and spray those and make sure it's nice and wet. Then you want to cover them with plastic or something so that the top doesn't dry out. And in a few days your seeds should germinate, and then you'll put them in the light to grow. Using the sprayer instead of like a stream of water to make sure that you don't displace the seeds, wash them away. So that is kind of your standard traditional way to start seeds. We're also going to start some using soil blocks, that's what these are called. And basically they're just compressed cubes of soil. And the advantage of them are, number one, you're not using any plastic, so they're a zero waste way to start your seeds. And secondly, if you notice, the roots will start to come out of the soil block, and in this case they will just stop growing because they hit the air. Whereas if you're using a plastic container of any kind, they'll start circling the inside of the container, and the plant can get root bound, which makes it harder for it to get water and nutrients. So it's better for the plant, also easier to plant when it comes time to put them in the ground. So we're gonna mix them. So the components of soil blocks that I use are, this stuff is called ProMix, and it's basically just a substrate to hold the plants, for the plant's roots to grow into, to support the plant. There aren't any nutrients or anything in this, but what's good about it is it has something called peat moss in it. And peat moss, when it's wet and pressed into a cube and then dries, the fibers kind of lock together, so they give some structure to the cube. So, because it doesn't have nutrients, we're also going to add some compost. So we're going to do 2 parts peat moss, 1 part compost. And the first thing we have to do is screen it, because wait till you see all the stuff that's in here. If there are big chunks of things in the soil block, that will affect the structural integrity and make it more likely that the block will break apart with watering. So this screen is 1/4 inch hardware cloth, 1/4 inch mesh, and it needs to be that tiny so that we can block all of these little twigs and things from going into our mix. The same thing with the compost. So what you have is pretty fine, not a lot of chunks in there. And the main difference between potting mix like we used for the cells and the mix we're going to use for soil blocks here is it needs to be much, much wetter. So we'll see. The peat moss takes a little time to absorb that's about where we were. That's nowhere near where we need to be. Still not good enough. You want to look for these big clumps when you push it around. See, that's good, but it needs to all be doing that, and it also needs to start to look kind of shiny. And sometimes, because it keeps absorbing the water, the peat moss keeps absorbing it, like it'll look good and you'll go to do them and it still needs a little filter. So it's best if you can do this and then let it sit for a while. See how it's getting those big clumps?
Yeah.
It's looking wet. That's what you want to see. I don't want to see like water pooling, because if it gets too wet, they just slide right out of the soil block maker. So these are some examples of soil block makers that we use on the farm, because you can do a whole bunch at one time. They come in different sizes depending on how long what you're growing is going to be growing in the soil block before going in the ground. The bigger ones will provide nutrition longer for the plant. These are great. Huge, but they eat up a ton of soil. All right, we're not going to use those today because home gardeners use a handheld one like this. These are about $30 on Amazon, and they have these little divots in them, so it's going to make a cube with a little divot where you're going to put your seed. The key when you're doing this is to twist it around and really pack it in there, and what you want to see, what you're going for, is the water coming up through the top of the block maker. See that? You have to have that. And then I'm going to scrape the bottom so that they'll sit nice and flat in your tray. So now you're going to squeeze down and keep it at a little bit of an angle, and then lay it flat, release. Ta-da! Soil blocks. Do a whole tray of those and ready to plant them up. So we're planting cantaloupe. It's not time for home gardeners to plant cantaloupe yet. These are going to be planted in the greenhouse, so we're starting them a little early. And we're just going to go one per block. And now we're just going to use some of the potting mix from before to cover these. And remember, you want to go about twice the diameter of the seed. So a little more on these. Basically, we're just going to fill that divot. Just wetting down the stuff we put in there. These soil blocks are plenty wet. One more step with these. We'll put some cinnamon on top of them, because cinnamon is antifungal, and seedlings, when they first emerge, can get a fungal disease called damping off that makes them just fall over and die. Soil blocks retain a lot of moisture, so they're a good environment for that kind of fungal disease, and the cinnamon helps with that. Same thing, cover it up, stick it somewhere till they germinate, then out into the light with them.